Last week we dealt with health and armor class for our creatures, and today we're going to get into attacks and damage resistances, so let's just dive right in. Hey fellow Game Masters, I'm Richard Quiner, and welcome back to the Daily D20, your daily dose of all things tabletop role-playing games, helping you build your world and master your game. Since today is yet another Monster Monday, I want you to keep me posted in the comments below what kind of creature you're making for your world, and a little more on the stats and the background and the information that we're going over in today's video. Now, moving forward, we're going to have to understand a simple concept for our monster called effective stats. Now, your monster will have a statistic, such as health, or damage per round, or armor class. But they also have the opportunity to have effective statistics, such as effective health or effective armor class. These effective numbers are what we will use later on to determine the actual challenge rating of the creature, while the actual numbers might not represent that so fully. We'll get into this a little more in a little bit, but just remember that your actual hit points does not always equal your effective hit points, and the same goes for other statistics as well that you might encounter while building our creature. And while these stats are important for creating the creature and figuring out the challenge ratings, they don't really have a whole big effect on the game in terms of what numbers you actually use. That being said, let's get into it now with some damage vulnerabilities, resistances, and immunities. Now, I've mentioned briefly in other videos the difference between vulnerability, resistance, and immunity, but we're going to recap anyway. Vulnerability means a creature takes double the damage from any attack of that damage type. And if you need to remember the different types of damage, I did have a video on that, so go check that one out and make sure you're caught up. Vulnerability is double the damage. Resistance means your creature takes half the damage from any attack dealing that type of damage. And immunity means exactly what it is. That creature is immune to any damage from that type, so they take no damage. So the question here is, how do we go about deciding what resistances or vulnerabilities or immunities this creature has? All you really should do is be looking at your character description that we wrote a couple weeks ago about where it comes from, what it looks like, what kind of skin it has, maybe, those kind of things, and then you can just decide what immunities or resistances it has. Same for vulnerabilities. So for example, if you have a creature that has a very thick skin or a tough outer shell, they might be resistant or even immune to damages that are of the non-magical variety, such as bludgeoning and piercing and slashing. If you have a creature that has an affinity with some sort of element, they might be resistant to that element, or they might be vulnerable to the element of the opposite effect, such as a ice-based creature might be resistant to cold damage but vulnerable to fire damage. And for this sample of the ice dwarf, I'm making it both resistant to cold damage and bludgeoning, because they are very sturdy people. So bludgeoning won't do as much work, and they live kind of in the ice. They have an affinity with ice, so they will also be resistant to cold damage. If you make a creature that has 2 or more resistances or immunities, you start to deal with effective hit points. Now, I mentioned the effective hit points are what we will use to determine the creature's challenge rating, even though that will not be the actual hit points of the creature. To figure out effective hit points, there is a convenient table in the Dungeon Master Guide that is titled Effective HP based on resistance and immunity, and you'll see that it's laid out by challenge rating, and it will have multipliers for if you have more than 2 resistances or more than 2 immunities. You'll also notice something interesting. At the low CR ratings, the multiplier will be ×2, but as you get higher in the challenge ratings, the multiplier will get less and less until you're really not dealing with much of a multiplier at all. That's because in later levels, your characters will likely have weapons or armor or magic that will nullify the actual resistances and vulnerabilities of your new creature. So the higher the level the players, the less important this resistance and immunities are. So to use this table, all you do is find your expected challenge rating in the left-hand column, go over to whatever you have, whether you have 2 resistances or 2 immunities, and then multiply your actual hit points by that number and note that down to get your effective hit points. For my Ice Dwarf, my normal hit points are 85. He is a challenge rating of 3 creature, so his effective hit points are going to be 170. You can already see the big difference that will make when determining the CR of the creature, because 170 it's double 85. So that boosts the challenge rating for that creature that much more. You'll see there's no table for vulnerabilities because, well, for one, it's very rare to find a creature with more than 1 vulnerability. It's not really good character design, especially if you want to challenge your creature. But in the case that you do have a creature with more than 1 vulnerability, 2 or more, you can use the same table of multipliers, but instead of multiplying, just divide the number by half. So if my Ice Dwarf were vulnerable to 2 or more things, I would take that 85 and divide it in half and have 42 hit points as effective hit points. Now let's get into the attack bonuses of our creatures. You have one option, of course. For all of these, you can look at the table of creature statistics by challenge rating, but we're gonna figure this out from our own, and it's going to be okay. Your creatures need attack bonuses because the players get attack bonuses, and those bonuses give a dramatic impact on how likely you are to hit or miss a creature. And you want to have the same benefits for your creature, so let's figure this out. When I'm just starting with a creature, I like to figure out attack bonuses for both melee weapons and ranged weapons because I don't know exactly what type of weapon the creature is going to use most often. I haven't decided that yet. So I'm going to figure out both the strength-based and the dexterity-based attack bonuses for my Ice Dwarf. To do this, all you need to do is look at the proficiency bonus that you listed earlier, which was based on the table of creature stats based on challenge ratings. For mine, it's a CR3, so my proficiency is a +2. It's not a lot, it's a pretty early level. Then you take that proficiency bonus and add it to the ability score modifier that is needed. So for melee weapons, you'll want to add your proficiency bonus to your strength modifier, and for range-based weapons, you need to add your proficiency bonus to your dexterity. For tiny creatures, they may have the opportunity to use both strength and dexterity for melee attacks, but it's really up to you as the GM what you want to do. So for my Ice Dwarf, since both my dexterity and strength are equal, they are both a +2 to my modifiers, adding the proficiency bonus to either one equals a +4, and that is my creature's attack bonus. Now I've got my Ice Dwarf ready to fight. He has hit points, he has damage resistance and vulnerabilities and some immunities, and now he is dealing with his attack bonus, which I can apply to whatever weapon he chooses to use. This next stat we're dealing with is quite a doozy, so buckle up. We're going to be doing a lot of math and doing a lot of creative thinking on this next one, and it is damage output of your creature. Now, for the table of challenge ratings and figuring out the creature challenge rating in the end, we have to figure out the damage output per round of the creature. And if you remember, I mentioned in another video, your damage output per round does not equal your damage output per attack. So we need to figure this out, but I personally like to start with the damage per attack and work my way up to the damage output per round. So how do you determine the damage output per attack? It's pretty simple. If your creature is using a manufactured weapon of any type, you look in the player handbook, find out what kind of damage and how much damage that item does, and note that down for the creature. So for my dwarf, the example will be that they will be wielding a battle axe, so they'll get a d8 damage plus strength of slashing damage per attack with their battle axe. A special note with manufactured weapons, the larger the creature, the larger the weapon will need to be. It would be a bit ridiculous to have a gargantuan monster using a sword that's meant for someone who's medium sized. So how do you figure out the damage for these larger creatures? It's pretty simple, just add more dice. So building off the same example, if I had a large creature using the battle axe, I would multiply the die by 2. So instead of 1d8 plus strength, it would be 2d8 plus strength. The same goes for a huge creature, you triple the amount, and for a gargantuan creature, you quadruple it. So a gargantuan creature wielding a battle axe would be 4d8 plus strength. The other type of damage output option you have is a little more custom to you and what you feel like, and it is raw natural damage that the creature might be able to inflict. This usually comes in the form of teeth and claws that the creature might have. To figure these out, I personally like to look in the book. I go to the monster manual, I find a creature that has an attack similar to the creature that I am building, and I can take the attack damage from that and use it on my own. But you have the freedom to put whatever type of damage die you want in this creature. So for one example is I may want to use a type of polar bear, and I may want to take a normal sized polar bear and make it even larger. So I can look up the polar bear statistics in the monster manual and see that its bite attack does a 1d8 damage. If I want to make this polar bear giant, I just multiply that by 2 and it does 2d8 damage for my giant polar bear, which maybe I'll do that later. That sounds like a really good creature to deal with Ice Dwarves. Now you figured out your creature's damage per attack. If you decide that your creature is going to have multiple attacks, so for my Ice Dwarves, I chose that I want to have them be able to attack twice with their battle axe and do a shield bash as well. So I'll have to figure out the damage for my shield bash. So if your creature is doing multi-attacks, try not to go crazy. Don't do something like 5 or 10 attacks on a turn, but 2 or 3 is usually the standard, and it's usually a good middle ground of where to go. Now that we've had the damage per attack figured out in terms of the die rolls, we need to figure it out as a actual number, and then we need to take those numbers, add them together to figure out the damage per round for our creature. So let's do a little bit of math. To figure out the average damage used for a die for a creature, you need to do a couple steps. So first, to figure out the average damage that you can roll with your certain creature and the die that they're using, you're going to need to take a couple steps. First, you're going to take the highest number possible on the die. For the battle axe, that's an 8. Next, you need to add 1 to that. So instead of 8, my number will be 9. So then take that number and divide it in half. So 9 divided by 2 equals 4.5. Take that 4.5 and multiply that by how many dice you're actually using. So this will come into play more when you're using the larger creatures, when you need to take the average die that you just figured out and multiply that by something else. My dwarf only uses 1d8, so it stays at 4.5. And then the last step you need to do is add on any modifiers. If it's a ranged weapon, add on some dexterity modifier. If it's a melee weapon, add on the strength modifier. Doing that takes my average damage per round up to a 6.5. Once you do this for one type of attack, you're going to be able to multiply and do more. If you have other types of dice, you'll need to repeat this math for every type of die for damage you're doing, and note down all the results. So if we put this all together, the Ice Dwarf has 2 attacks with the Battle Axe doing 6.5 damage each. Add both of those together, you get 13 damage for your Battle Axe attacks. For the Shield Bash, I decided it's going to do a 1d6 plus strength bludgeoning damage, so doing that same math, I end out with a 5.5 damage per Shield Bash. Now I add them all together and I get 18.5. It's always better to round up when you have 0.5s because it's a little more scary, so the average damage per round for my Ice Dwarf will be 19. I hope you followed along so far. I know that was a lot of math. Now you've figured out your creature's damage resistances, its attack bonus, and the damage output it has available to it. We're about halfway done building our creature. If you've missed the other videos and need to find more about how to build the basic creature stats, go ahead and click on this video over here. For the next step in this process, you're going to need to click over here. And of course, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.